Thank you very much. I wanted to start off with just a few comments, really appreciating the amount of work that's gone into this effort. I think that there are very few comparable kinds of large-scale assessments in the sector that are as comprehensive and really as extensive as this. Of course, when you do something like this, it raises all kinds of questions. And so what I'd like to do with a few minutes is to ask some and to pose some things that perhaps are relevant for the policy community. On the question side, one is often faced in developing a process like this with a fixed point in time prior to which data is available and you therefore use it, and subsequent to which data was not yet available at the time of the report. And so the report has a delay, and many of us have had a chance to work on other reports that do the same thing. So in some sense, it's a bit time-bound. So always interesting to think about the elements of the report that are not so constrained. And that's, I think, going to be an important development. As I look at the current investment community, for example, this last year was not as good as the previous year. If we look at the current investment parameters in renewable energy, for example, we maybe have a slightly different story today we might have had a year and a half ago when the data was stopped. In a similar sense, in the US context in particular, the explosion of natural gas discoveries and extraction capacity at very low cost is shaping the development of the energy sector. And it was not something you could have projected easily in your assessment, but could fundamentally alter, at least for one country, and then potentially by extension for others, some of the dynamics in the system. I wanted to come back to a couple of points that you do make, which I think have much longer-lived outcomes. In particular, the idea of integration of the various components that you've addressed in the report. The notion that the energy sector can be neatly sliced into an element that's about energy security, that's nicely separated from an element about access, that's nicely separated from an environmental component, which in turn is separated from a global climate component, I think is false, and you've nicely addressed this. And this integration, I think, is a critical component of your conclusion. But at the same time, it raises the difficulty for the policy community, which is in fact not as integrated. And the dynamic of how you use a report of this volume with this kind of detail that presumes an integration when the policy community is divided and has its own separate issues, its own separate responsibilities, often not intersecting in the slightest, when you have demonstrated quite clearly the advantage of integration. I think there's going to be a key question about how to manage that. I then come to a last question which I want to address, and it has to do with what I think of as political realism versus academic certainty. It's very straightforward to develop a set of models. To a certain extent, they run quickly, though, into the paradigm and the problem of the political difficulties of moving policy forward. They're going to be different for each country. You can write an assessment, as this one does, which suggests that by the year 2030 or maybe 2050, we could actually have negative emissions from some part of the energy sector. I think that's a plausible technological scenario. What's not yet clear is that the investment in the technology has begun that would enable that to happen at scale. And the investments being made by a somewhat different constituency than those that might create mandates to require the action that could shift the energy sector with such technologies. So again, we have this disparate vision in terms of how things are done. And so to me, one of the questions that arises, how do we make the link between the political reality of what's possible, what is currently happening, and the desirable outcomes that you point us to? And I think it's a lesson, perhaps for us, in the work that you've done, to begin to indicate the need for more integration. And that brings me to my final point, which is that to a certain extent, you've developed, I think, what's an amazing product, but a little inaccessible. And how does one take that volume of information, this vast piece of data, extraordinary detail, and make it available? I was struck in the meeting that we've just concluded with the clean energy ministers that the report didn't come up. We didn't use it. We didn't take the lessons that had been so carefully developed in this analysis and apply them, because in fact we were talking about these problems. We were addressing the issues of clean energy in the context of climate, in the context of access, and yet this data was not at the heart of the discussion. And to me, there's a question about how does this very important kind of information become part of the public dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very perceptive comments and very constructive.